Hello, how you doing there, friends? Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it might be in your part of the world, and even if you're watching the recording out there, hello to you, future people out there. My name is Jeff Fritz, and welcome to Let's Learn .NET Aspire. This is the first in a series of live learning opportunities and recordings that you're going to find that are available in a series of different languages that are going to help you learn more about the new technology tools that we have available to you in .NET called .NET Aspire. We're really excited about this stuff. There's all kinds of great features in here that are going to help make you a better developer, help your applications find success, scale, and grow to meet you and your customers' needs. I see a bunch of folks here in chat. Hello, welcome in chat room. I see a number of my colleagues here. I see a bunch of folks saying they're excited tuning in. I see Emmanuel from Lagos. Um, taking a look. Somebody here says they love .NET Aspire, using it in a big project. Andrew is here from Spain. My goodness, it's great to see folks. Thank you so much tuning in and joining us. DJ Deepex is here watching from Germany. Thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in. It's great to see you. Really appreciate folks joining us for this. Now, my name is Jeff Fritz. I want to put the slides back up here. There we go. If you want to get in touch with me, you can find me on all the services. You can find me on X. You can find me on YouTube, on GitHub, on Twitch. I am C# Fritz in all the places. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about what .NET Aspire is and get into things. And I'll be keeping an eye on chat so we can answer some questions, do a little Q&A as we go through and see some of the demos throughout our session here today. Now, all the learning resources that we have as part of this workshop, if you don't want to listen to me run my mouth and you just want to get right into it and go through it at your own pace, that's cool. All of it's available for you, aka.ms/letslearn/.net/aspire. All right. There's a workshop repository available that we're going to be going through that has these slides, that has the demos we're going to show. github.com.net/letslearn.net/aspire. All right. Thank you for sharing the links in chat. Much appreciate. Now, this is a beginner session. We're not going to be talking too much about deployment. We're not going to be talking about crazy, huge, amazing architecture systems that you've heard about and that you want to put together. We have other materials for folks that want to learn about how to do some advanced architecture concepts. This is a beginner session where we're going to introduce some of the .NET Aspire concepts that are going to get you into your journey building and being successful, building applications that could be deployed to the cloud, could be deployed to Azure, to AWS, to Kubernetes, even deployed locally. But we're going to show you how you can be successful with .NET Aspire as a developer tool running on your workstation. All right. So, of course, we know .NET is your tool, your framework, your set of libraries and resources that you can use to build anything with that unified development platform. We developers love it. Businesses trust it. All right. It's an amazing set of tools and libraries for you. We know .NET enables developers to build any kind of application with a best-in-class runtime, series of programming languages, development tools, and a huge ecosystem powered by amazing developers, communities, and businesses, vendors out there all over the world. You can build all kinds of applications, not just for the cloud, web applications, desktop, mobile, gaming, IoT, and even AI, right? Massive number of things that you can do with .NET. Now, we know in talking to customers, in engaging and working with other developers and businesses, that no matter what type of application you're building, every app needs four things. Okay. You're going to need to be observable. You're going to want to get those deep insights while you're debugging, and you want to know what's going on inside your applications before you push that out to production. You want your application to be resilient so that, if internet connectivity changes, if there's a bunch of pressure on your system or some of your dependent services, that it can handle it. And no matter what happens, your application is always up. You want your applications to be scalable so that if there is a lot of pressure coming through, my goodness, it's that Friday in November that everybody's going shopping, and you want your service to be able to handle that increased pressure. Or maybe it's the day of the big game, and everybody's coming to check out your website as part of that promotion. And gosh, you want to be able to handle that extra attention that your application is getting. Absolutely. You want to be able to serve anywhere from a few hundred people to tens of thousands that come through. And finally, as developers, we want to be able to manage these applications, right? You want to make it easy for you to get in, make changes, enhance, and easily deploy them using tools like continuous integration so that you can rapidly iterate on your applications. These are big things. These are things that are going to make our jobs as developers easier. Well, in .NET 8, the current version of .NET at the time of this recording, there's a ton of features that already support some of these requirements that we have, whether it's built-in metrics with dimensions, dependency injection with metrics to help support observability, resiliency packages that are based on the Poly community package that's available out there, scalability capabilities that are going to help you with performance, and chiseled Ubuntu packages that allow you to deploy your container and run with a smaller, faster runtime and ecosystem. And of course, manageability, we've got features built in there as well. So, all kinds of things that are built in with .NET 8 that are going to get you in the right direction to get started. But it's still not easy. These are features that are available to us, but it's not easy. It can be complex, identifying and figuring out which pieces we need to put together, right? Getting started, there's a lot of options that are out there that I need to figure out how they plug into my existing applications when I want to go and add some of these new features. I want to enhance and make things more observable. I want to make sure that I take advantage of some of those new resilience capabilities. How do I get them layered in so that I don't have to make as many choices? I can choose a paved path that other folks who have built similar projects to mine or even more complex applications than mine have been successful. What's a good set of recommendations that I can use to make my application better? And this is where .NET Aspire comes in. Okay? .NET Aspire is a cloud-ready stack for building observable, production-ready, and distributed applications. Now, the team built this after talking to not just customers, but internal Microsoft customers as well. Folks that build some of the web applications that you see when you go to Microsoft applications, their input fed into some of the design decisions that helped shape what .NET Aspire is. And that means you get the benefit of all of that great experience from folks that have built massive applications out there. So, what does that mean? Who's it for? Should I use it? Now, look, when we think about huge applications that have dozens of microservices out there and APIs they connect to, and databases and service bus and email applications and whatnot. My gosh, there's so much going on there. It's so complex. Is that really for me just building a little website that talks to a database or maybe even something smaller? The short answer in our opinion, and I absolutely believe in this, is with the tools that come for you in .NET Aspire, yes. Every application can learn, can benefit from the features that .NET Aspire has in it that are going to give you a good experience as a developer. Doesn't matter how big, doesn't matter how small, you're going to benefit from using .NET Aspire. All right? Let me explain a little bit here. So let's say you're building a website, right? And we've got this website right over here, the eShop website. It's northernmountains.net. Sounds familiar. Sounds like some other shops that we've had at the past floating around in the .NET sample ecosystem. This is a sports website. Many of us have built something like this. You've browsed to somewhere online and you look at it and think, my gosh, what goes into building this application? Because there's all kinds of concerns we have when we build even a storefront like this over here. Um, whether you have a small team or a big team, there's a lot of things going on here between managing product lists like we see down there, managing the content, the layout, managing how orders are processed. There's a lot to this that we need to account for, manage, and make sure that they all talk to each other properly. Now, of course, at the very beginning, right? You're gonna have a small website that you start with that that is really monolithic almost, where you've got a web application. It might be a Blazor application in this case, but it could be MVC, it could be Razor Pages, but it's a small web app, and it's gonna read some data from somewhere. Maybe it's a JSON file sitting on disk. Maybe it's connecting into a database like SQL Server. Sure. With this small little website, there's plenty that .NET Aspire can help with. We'll see a little bit more about that. But as this application grows and we put maybe an API in front of a database, maybe Postgres, there's all kinds of things that changes and grows, and we now need to account for as developers as we communicate with our API and our API connects to that database. I'm going to want to set up different connections. I'm going to want to set up different connections and ingress capabilities for my API, for my database, because my website is allowed to query the API. My API is allowed to query the database, but folks on the outside, folks on the public internet, might not be able to interact with that. So we have some options and some configuration that changes and shifts there as this grows, as our application matures and gets more capabilities. So, how do we start to handle that and be able to do more with it as our application grows? Because once it's like this, it's and we get more and more pressure, and we want to handle those big shopping days that come through. Gosh, just before the skiing season starts, in we want to enhance our application, and it may grow into an even bigger system of features here, where we have client apps like a mobile app and our browser based web application that are connecting in and interacting with a series of APIs that each have their own separate database instances. Maybe there's a cache implementation there with Redis and a payment processor service that's hanging out there as well. And maybe these things all talk to each other using a service bus, something like RabbitMQ or Azure Service Bus. And gosh, maybe there's even recommendations or other analysis that we're doing based on how folks interact with our application. And we want to reach out to OpenAI and do some interactions with that to make recommendations and whatnot. Lots of things that start to go as our shop becomes more sophisticated. And there's all these arrows that are different touch points between the applications that we want to make sure are things that we can monitor and manage and make sure are resilient so that those connections don't break, so that they do get good responses and we're able to get the visitors to our website the data they need, the interactions that they want. So, .NET Aspire works with all of those scales. All right. We're going to take a demo application here and we're going to start off showing just a little monolithic application. We're going to introduce it. We're going to see that it can have some challenges managing it, but when it's just a little application and it's just me, it's just Jeff, the developer, managing it, it's not too bad. We can deal with that. We can manage and look for things, and then we're going to slowly grow that application and see how we benefit from adding .NET Aspire into our application. My productivity is going to improve. I'm going to get great insights into how my application works. And best of all, my end users, the visitors to my website, are going to have a good experience as well. So let's talk a little bit more about the six things that .NET Aspire gives us. All right. It gives us a series of smart defaults. It gives us a great developer dashboard, and that's the thing that most folks have heard about. And we're gonna press pause on that developer dashboard and come back to that in a little bit. We're gonna see how we can orchestrate all the parts of our application so that we're sure that those things communicate with each other. And service discovery so that we don't have to maintain lists of various services to connect with. We'll be able to bring in various components to enhance our application system. And we're even going to see how Aspire makes it a snap to deploy to your favorite web service, to your favorite cloud service too. All right. Let's let's take a step into our demo. All right. Now, if you want to check out the demo, if you want to get your own copy, you want to run it locally, you're going to want to clone the GitHub repository. We showed it earlier. Here's the link again: github.com/.net presentations /let's learn .net Aspire. There we go. My colleagues are dropping a message there in chat with the link, so make it easier for folks. If you're watching the YouTube recording, it's in the description just below. And if you're watching the live presentation, there it is in the chat room, and on all of the services we're broadcasting to. All right. Here we go. Let's go over to Visual Studio and let's take a look at our application. Now, this is a little application called My Weather Hub. I know, we've been doing the weather demos with .NET things for a while. But the thing with the weather demos that we give with .NET are they're all random number generated, right? It's, oh, we're going to randomly generate a number for the temperature, and we're going to randomly choose a condition and put them next to each other. And you end up seeing things like, the temperature is going to be 20 degrees Celsius and it's chilly. Maybe 20 degrees Fahrenheit is chilly, but 20 degrees Celsius is kind of warm. And our friends in the UK are looking at 20 degrees Celsius and saying, that's pretty sweltering, but you're calling it chilly, right? It's a random number thing. So we talked about this and said, what would be a really good demo for this would be if we took some data and we took a dependency on an external service that actually gives us real forecasts. And that's what we did. The United States National Weather Service makes an API available at apiweather.gov. And if you take a look at the GitHub repository, you'll see links to that repository where you can get this information. It's a publicly accessible API that you can use to query and get information about weather in the United States. So we put together just a little method here to get weather forecasts, and it sets up a little HTTP client, right? We've seen add HTTP client inside of our web applications before, and it's going to connect to API Weather Gov, and they require that we specify a user agent in order to use their API. No problem. So we'll set our user agent to Microsoft.NET Aspire demo. And then we can go through and query and bring back information about the various weather stations that are available. And we can then select one of those, do a secondary query to get the forecast for that weather station. So here's my simple demo that comes up, and I'm using a Blazor quick grid here on the left, and I added some text on the right to explain a little bit of information and give you that link to the National Weather Service, as well as information about a couple of locations that might be easier for folks who aren't familiar with the United States geography to go and locate some interesting places to search for. So there's a bunch of data here that I can page through very quickly and see locations, observation stations. They call them zones in the nomenclature of the National Weather Service. But for the various states here, I'm going to search for a weather station that's close to me here in Philadelphia. Okay, so I live just outside Philadelphia, so I'll choose Philadelphia, and I get a little weather forecast here. Now, of course, this is a weather forecast by folks in the United States. So all the temperatures that you'll see here are in Fahrenheit. So we can take a look and see that here we're going to have hot and high in the upper 80s, winds 5 to 10 miles an hour tonight. Lows in the mid 60s. All right, that's good sleeping weather. Lows in the mid 60s. I like that. Okay, but this is live data. All right, I can go back up here and I'm going to change this and let's go find the weather for Manhattan. So there's New York, Manhattan, and I can see they've got similar weather in Manhattan. So you're welcome to tinker with this and play with this. The sample data and the API is available for you to check out. But you see that it's making requests on the server out to my ASP.NET web server is making requests out to these various locations to get weather. So I can go and look at the city of Juneau, Alaska, right? And if I choose another state here, let's choose Arizona, and I can choose some other locations here. Oh no, this kind of thing could happen, right? Now there is spoiler alert, there is a purposeful exception that's thrown in the code to make sure that we show that we could occasionally have errors. And when you think about it, when we're querying and getting data for weather observation stations around the United States, there could be times where you go to query a location in Arizona and gosh, there's a storm coming through. There's a sandstorm, there's things happening, and they're not going to respond. Sorry, I don't have data right now. I'm going to return an error from the API, and you need to handle it. It's not a great experience, but I mean, I can certainly tell folks, well, go just click somewhere else and come back, and it might reconnect and find that. And when this is a small application and it's just Jeff Fritz running this, and I'm sharing my weather forecast app with my family, a couple of my buddies, they're able to come through and look at this and works great. That's all they need. Hey, all right, I can hit F5, no big deal. But when we start expanding and we want to make this weather service available for more users to interact with it, it's not a great experience, you know? So those are things that we're looking at in this application that we want to address. And I can certainly go and look at the logs running over here, and I can see the logs, and it's just me, it's just running on my web server, and I can clearly see, there was an error getting that forecast. And at some point I'll go through and fix it. It's a little application, no big deal, right? A temporary thing. That doesn't matter to me. And that might be fine at a smaller scale, but at some point you're going to want to fix that. You're going to want to make it easier. You're going to want to be able to handle those types of errors that come through. So let's talk more about that. We've seen how our application runs. So let's talk more about how we can infuse a little bit of .NET Aspire. Dare I say, we aspirify our application here a little bit and talk about some of these things that we can do to make our application better. Now, first thing that I want to talk about are smart defaults. All right. Now, this is something that is going to start down this path of adding observability, resiliency, and health checks into our application. All right. These are already available as .NET packages that are available on NuGet, or some of them are available as part of the base class library. You can go ahead and configure these things. You can add them into your application without .NET Aspire, without any of the features that I'm going to show you. They're available. They're easy to set up and add in there. You're going to need to do a little spelunking to go find the appropriate commands and things that suit your scenario to get them set up and working. But with a series of service defaults, smart defaults, you're going to be able to integrate in a set of defaults that are recommended by the ASP.NET Core team that are going to make your application a good bit better immediately. All right. So, what does that mean? What kind of things are we talking about here? So, the first thing we're going to talk about is configuring OpenTelemetry. Now, OpenTelemetry is an open source standard that's quickly becoming the de facto way of getting deep metrics and stack traces and insights from your application. So, with ASP.NET Core, OpenTelemetry is deeply integrated into the built in logging services, the metrics that are published, and the tracing services that come with the ASP.NET framework. So, you can add a few lines of code like we see here that are going to get you up and running, but with the Aspire configuration and service defaults, we're going to give you one line of code that allow you to enable this and set up exporters so that if you want to publish your data to other places, you want to publish it to Prometheus or Azure Monitor or to a third-party service that'll manage and track this information for you, it's all there with just a few lines of code. Okay. So that's the first piece that we can do for observability. So now we get the ability in Aspire, it looks like this. Now we can say add OpenTelemetry exporters, and it will automatically configure those gRPC based exporters to publish content to whatever endpoint you want. And you can see there by default, we give you a little commented out section that will publish to Azure Monitor so that you can consume and see that when you publish and use Azure and interact with those services and be able to use your Azure dashboards to consume this information. All right. So that's great. That's a little bit about observability. But the next thing we want to talk about, of course, is resiliency. So resiliency means, hey, retry on a reasonable time span so that if there's a problem with a connection, we'll retry and see if we can get the data, we can get the connection, get the information that we need and present a good experience. So there's a standard resilience handler that's baked into the framework. It's part of a NuGet package that you can install, and this will use a standard resiliency timeout to try and request and make a second effort to get data if there's an error. And if there is an error, it has a series of sensible backoffs so that it will continue trying without necessarily flooding and knocking over a service. Now, this is based on some defaults that the ASP.NET team has felt are some sensible options for us to choose. You can tweak and provide some timing and some capabilities in here that meet your application's specific needs. Now, the next one, something that we've had baked in for a while that folks have been using that becomes really important to use in your applications is health checks. And health checks, of course, are those endpoints that are going to make the status of your application visible to some sort of monitoring service. So, with a few lines of code, we can respond with my application is live, it's properly running, and allow that monitoring service, whether it's something like Azure Front Door or it's some orchestration that's going on with a third party application or something like Kubernetes, that it knows that your application is running properly and that it can integrate and send requests into those applications. Now, there's a series of defaults that are baked in here, and these are okay for what you need to get running and communicate that your application is running properly in production. Of course, you can tweak and extend these to add other information that you may want to communicate so that you have maybe degraded services. You want folks to know that they need to step down and start using other instances of your application as well. Add standard resilience handler. There's a question in chat about that. Yes, that is available outside .NET Aspire. That is available. There you go. Thank you for putting the message up there. That is available as part of the one of the .NET NuGet packages. So, all right. Thank you so much. So let's go back to our little weather hub there. And let's add in. We saw how I had to look on the command line to see how the log's working. I want to break out that interaction with the National Weather Service and put that in an API so I can start to add more websites that are interacting with it without having to have many, many HTTP clients. So I'm going to separate that and let's start adding in some of those resiliency capabilities and some of those smart defaults into our application so that we can take advantage of these features that are already part of the .NET 8 tooling, but we're going to get sensible smart defaults because we're going to use the Aspire configuration that's available to us. So I'll go back over to Visual Studio, and this is where Fritz gets back into doing some live coding. So I will go up here to File, I'll go to my recent projects and solutions, and you'll see there's a folder inside the repository called Start with API. So this is the second step in the process where we've taken that interaction with the National Weather Service and we've put it into an API project that you see up here. And it has this NWS manager, National Weather Service Manager. It's the exact same thing. We just copied it over into this other folder so that it knows how to go and communicate with apiweather.gov. So we just moved all of that over to this project and we configured it with a little bit of minimal API here. So you see there's a map API endpoints, and you can see we turn on output caching here so that we'll cache some of the results in memory. I have a request to zones that will use an open API endpoint called get zones that it exposes. There you go, with open API. And I have my second API endpoint forecast where it's expecting a zone ID, and we'll call that get forecast by zone. Publish that with open API so then our application can connect in and read that. But our application needs to know where that's running so that it can connect in and run it. So if I go into my program for the Blazor application for my Weather Hub website that folks will connect in and use, it's doing that same add HTTP client up here, but it's going to reach into its configuration file to go find out what's the API endpoint that we're connecting to, because we need to know where that API lives to go and read that. And I similarly have that NWS manager out here, but now it knows how to use the HTTP client to go get those endpoints from the API that I exposed. So we've wrapped our interaction with our external weather service so that if something changes, maybe I want to set that up so it uses another weather service instead of the National Weather Service. Maybe I want to use it for a different geography. I can use that same API and swap out where it connects, and my weather service, my Weather Hub website application still functions the same way. I need to start multiple projects now because I've got two components to this, right? I've got my API project and I've got my website. So if I start this now, we'll see it starts two websites. And we'll be able to look and see the API and our open API documentation, and we'll also see our website, our Weather Hub website, that is showing me that rich user interface. There it is, that we want to present and share for our users to interact with. So there's the Weather Hub, and I should have another one. There it is. So there's my open API documentation that lets me see what's going on inside my API project, right? It started two websites. They're sitting here right next to each other, and it still functions the same way, right? I can go up here, and I'm going to search for Los Angeles this time. So there's Los Angeles, and I'll bring up their weather, and it fetches and returns the data. And everything runs nicely here. It still runs the same way, and I've got my multiple services that are communicating with each other. And I did have to wire that up a little bit by hand and know exactly where things are living. We'll learn more about that in a little bit. But this does work the way that I was expecting it to. So let me go find, let's go to New York State, and I should be able to click through into a couple of these and see that there's that error again. And now that I have multiple websites running, Well, I've now got multiple places to find logs, and I've got a log over here that says there was an internal server error, but this was which one was this? This was um that was my website. Okay. And over here, this is my API, and I can see the error there. And it's hard for me to correlate between the two as well. So let's start introducing these smart defaults that are going to help us to brush over, to smooth over some of these scenarios and make it a little bit easier to read and coordinate some of this data. So I'm going to close out of that. And inside Visual Studio, now I'm using Visual Studio here in Windows. You're going to be able to do the same thing at the command line with the .NET tools. If you're on Mac or Linux, these templates are available for you as well. I'm going to add a new project to my solution. And the project we're going to add, here it comes. I'll filter for my Aspire projects. We're going to add the .NET Aspire service defaults. Okay. So this is what contains those smart defaults that we're going to add into our application. And I'm just going to call this service defaults. Okay. Yeah, that's fine. You can go ahead and write over that. Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to have to go delete some code here. Give me 1 second. So this is the behind the scenes. You know this is live because Fritz has already run through this a couple times, and he's already got the code sitting out there on disk, and he needs to go delete it before we get started here. So there we go. Go ahead and create that folder, that project, and there you go. You see a little service defaults project pops up down there. Okay. And inside here, we have a series of extension methods that include those features we just talked about for observability, for resilience, and for manageability. So we see here add service defaults. We have this entry point that configures OpenTelemetry, configures health checks, and configures service discovery, as well as HTTP client defaults, including, like we saw the question about earlier, that standard resilience handler. So I can now use this, and you're welcome to scroll down and see how those are configured in this file. But I can now include this inside both other projects, and they'll now know how to use that service default, those smart defaults inside their websites. Now, our friend Damien showed me that if you can actually drag this project onto the other projects, and in Visual Studio, it'll add that project reference for you just by dragging it. You don't have to right click and go all the way through the add project reference. So that was easy. That made it pretty easy for me to get those connected. But now I need to make sure that my application knows to use those smart defaults. So I'm going to go into, this is the program for the API, right? For the API? Yeah. And I'm going to add those service defaults. So I'll just go up here and say builder, add service defaults. And you saw there's nothing keeping me from saying, you know what, add the default health checks that were in that configuration. I don't need all the things, just add the default health checks. But for folks that are just getting started, add the service defaults, see what it gives you to start with, and then decide what you may want to peel back on or change configuration appropriately. I'm going to grab that statement because I want to do the exact same thing over in my website. So I'll just add it right there to add those service defaults so my website can do the same things as my API and have those the telemetry, the health checks, and resiliency. So that's it. I added 2 lines, one to each of my 2 projects. I'll start this again, and it'll start the 2 websites, one for the API, one for the Blazor project. And now we're going to start to see how immediately our project is improved and able to connect these. Look at that. In chat, Bruno says he's old school, adding projects the old way, right-clicking and add project. Bruno, I'm the same way. I kind of prefer that, and I do that almost by default. So here's my uh, weather application running, and I can click through and start interacting with some of these, and there's some data coming back, and it's it looks like it's working properly, and I'll even go out and find that Philadelphia weather. There you go, Philadelphia, and there it loads. Let's clear that out. Let's bring up some of those. And I like going to the New York weather here, and what you're noticing, I'm not getting that error, right? Every now and again, there's one that takes just a little bit longer, but I'm not getting that error when it was loading weather data. Let's go back over to the code and take a look. There are errors happening in here, and this is the API, and you can see inside of here, it's got a retry policy that it's going through and using when it makes requests out to the weather service. Okay, and it is still throwing that error that I put in here, random exception, right? We inserted that to kind of demonstrate this feature, and that error didn't come through to our application, right? So if we take a look at the other console, we can see here, right? Scrolling up, right? Warning, Poly execution attempt, result 500. It failed making the request. It got that error, that random execution error, and it retried. And it got the right data. And it presented it. Okay? So we're immediately seeing this resiliency. We're seeing this connectivity and information about what's happening, and we can start to correlate and see how things work together. All right. Now, it's a little bit weird to try and connect data between the two of these so that we can see a full set of what's actually happening in those requests. And it's also it's a little weird to have two applications here and two log files and bounce back and forth between them. In a larger scenario where I might have dozens of these services, these API endpoints, it's going to get a little hairy. Yeah, it's going to get a little dicey. You know what I mean? We're going to end up playing whack-a-mole with log files. You know what I mean? You're going to have to go through and is it this one? Is it that one? Is it this one? Is it that one? Where did these things go? And as a developer, you don't want to waste your time with that. You want to be able to see the entire process of how these things occur and work with each other. So that's where we're going to start looking next. All right. Is how does the dashboard help us with this? Before we get to that, I want to pause for just a few minutes and take your questions. I've gone through, I've shown you a lot. This is our first bit of introduction to what's going on with .NET Aspire. I want to pause for a little bit of Q&A and see if there's anything that you have questions about that we've done so far that is a little bit different from what you've seen. At this point, we haven't so much added something that's new and specific to Aspire. All that we've done is activate features that are already there in .NET, but we've activated them with a prescribed way that .NET Aspire has packaged for us nicely in the template. Yeah, let's go to this comment here from James. Notice you said there were health checks configured in the smart defaults. How would you set that up? So they are set up, they are in there, and because, right, because we did that add service defaults here, those health checks are being called, they're being referenced right here on line 22 inside the template service service defaults project. And if I F12 into that, you can see here that there are add check statements that are being done to add other checks into your application. You can do this builder services add health checks. This is available to you in your ASP.NET application, and you can add other checks there to go reach in and make sure that your website can still connect to a database. Your website can connect into your Redis cache, your output cache. So being able to extend this is absolutely something that you can do in your application right after add service defaults, right? I can add those additional checks. Maybe my API service here, I want to add an additional check to this that says, are you able to reach weather.gov? Maybe something changes with the network connection, and I can put that check in here. And if I can't reach my endpoint, I want to report back that it's unhealthy. There's samples. We have source code that shows you how to do this. We have a link here that shows you how to configure and add more information to your health checks, make them more detailed, and test other features that you may want to interact with. Thanks so much for the question. Let me go to Eric here. Says maybe off topic, but as the app grows and goes live, how would you detect and mitigate a distributed denial of service, a DDoS attack? Even though it's nice that .NET is fast, how would you be able to mitigate and handle that? So that type of attack that might come in is something, it is a little bit off topic because that's something that we recommend folks mitigate using something like Azure Front Door, some sort of a reverse proxy, an entrance point that is going to be able to detect and offload those requests. Use things like a CDN, a content delivery network, so that you you mitigate those responses, hand them off to other servers, and spread out that load a little bit, as well as reject some of those requests that might be coming in maliciously. And tools like Front Door and the Azure CDN capabilities have that type of DDoS detection capability built in. For us as developers, it's something that we don't want to have to worry about. And fortunately, there are tools available, not just on Azure, but on many hosting providers that you can activate to help protect your application so that then we can focus on the things that we do best, building our applications and using our expertise and our colleagues' subject matter expertise to deliver the business value that we really want in our applications. Let that mitigation go to someone else, to security professionals, to hosting providers that know how to mitigate that well for us. Thanks so much for the question. Robbie on YouTube asks, can we add this to older projects on .NET 6 without breaking anything? Yes and no. Some of the default syntax that you see here, and I'm going to scroll back up to the top, the add service defaults uses the iHost application builder interface to extend. And if you use the previous syntax that we encouraged folks to use, the iHost builder that had a program CS separate from a startup file, you'll see that this syntax doesn't exactly work with that. And you have options. You can upgrade to using the web application startup so that it does the exact same things. It's just a different syntax that tries to make your startup process a little bit clearer. You don't have to use that. It's a way that we recommend because we think that it's much clearer and easier to read your code as it pertains to your application startup. If you don't want to do that, you can certainly access and call some of these methods directly and enhance them so that they hang off of the appropriate interfaces to work with your application. If you want to work with even older versions of the framework and tools, some of these service defaults aren't going to be available for you, but you can still use those projects, those tools as part of .NET Aspire, and we'll tiptoe into that space in the next few minutes. Can Aspire can Aspire be used with? I'm looking for that one. Can be used on Azure Simple Functions app. Azure Functions is a little bit tricky when we talk about that. What you're going to find with Azure Functions is that it's not something that we support out of the box. It is, however, something that you can connect in and use. The service defaults don't necessarily apply to it because Azure Functions run inside of a runtime that is managed by Azure. So the features that you would be adding here are actually already in there. They're actually part of the Azure Functions runtime. The HTTP client defaults are not in there. You would have to add that yourself. But Azure functions are just outside the scope of things that we can support out of the box with capabilities of .NET Aspire. Thanks for the question. Next question I see here from Dukasoft. I noticed you were able to start small, like a small business. How small can we go? Will it work on one project, only paying for one hosted app? Absolutely, absolutely does. I started with this model with the hosted with API folder in the sample code. I could have started with the startup application that was just in single project hosting. I forget the name of the folder. I could have done that and added the service defaults to it and gotten the logging, service discovery. Well, we'll see service discovery in a minute. HTTP client defaults, health checks, and add all of those capabilities to it. You absolutely can do that. And as we add more features to .NET Aspire, you certainly can do that, and it'll give you that paved path to grow on going forward. What I think you'll see is that the things that we're adding, when you have more services, it becomes clearer why you want to use some of those features, and um, consequently, we do make our application grow a little bit as part of this workshop, so that folks can clearly see where the benefits are. But you will see the similar benefits in one project. It's going to be a little bit trickier to go and find those, though, but you will absolutely see those benefits. All right. That's the last of the comments that I see there. Okay, good. Jumping back in then. Anything else? We're going to talk about the dashboard in just a minute. You want to add to an existing app like ASP.NET MVC, ASP.NET Core 6. Let me bring that comment up there. Or Web API. You do not need to update to .NET 8. These features are available to you. You will be able to add and reference and use them as part of this. So, you extensively use Azure Functions, says Mizzou Man. How does it work with that? Right now, it's kind of a hodgepodge to get it running with Azure Functions. You can do it with the local Azure Function emulator. But like I said, the Azure Functions runtime delivers a bit of what's already here that you're looking for. The HTTP resiliency and the health checks are being handled by the runtime for you. You don't have to do anything extra for that. But the HTTP resiliency, you can absolutely drop in there to work with. Friendly URLs coming up. Coming up. Spoiler alert. I love the excitement folks have and already stepping into some of the upcoming topics. We're going to get there. We're going to get there, friends. All right. Let me head back to the slides and let's step into the next segment here. I'll be pausing for Q&A after the next demo as well. All right. So let's talk about that developer dashboard. And I see the folks in chat talking about the dashboard. Now that we have those smart defaults, let's start giving a little bit of giving our developers a little bit of insight and the ability to peek into that without having to go through multiple log files and interacting with things. The developer dashboard is going to give us those insights, and it's also going to improve the manageability of our application system so that we don't have to do multiple project startup, so that we can interact with and see our projects working and interact with them in a nice manner. I'm going to pause quickly for that message that came in because this is a common question that we get, and I want to make sure that I address this. Is Microsoft trying to replace the Docker Kubernetes stack? No. This is not Microsoft trying to replace Docker and Kubernetes. This is the .NET team attempting to give a opinionated experience that makes it easier and drives down the amount of configuration that you need to use those tools and services. In fact, .NET Aspire relies heavily on Docker and Kubernetes for a bit of the capabilities that we have here. We've abstracted away some of those features to make it easier for folks to work with that, and so that when you publish, makes it easier to work with. As well, there's a number of things that you have to configure by hand with Kubernetes that just light up by default as part of .NET Aspire. So let's jump in to a little bit more about the dashboard. So what's great about the developer dashboard is that it gives you one-stop shopping to be able to take a look at your entire application, see all of your projects running, and give you deep visualization using OpenTelemetry and view the traces and see a complete stack of what's going on in there. Now, the dashboard is built with Blazor, so that means it uses .NET and it uses our Fluent UI components to make it beautiful to look at, easy to work with, and see the data you're looking for to manage all the components of your application system. And I'm not saying just an application, but your entire system, right? Right now we have an API project and we have a web project. It's more than just those two projects. It's the system that includes connecting them together. All right. So you can integrate the dashboard into your own projects. There's a couple ways to do this. Now, if you want to just run it as a standalone process, it's available as a container out there. You can find it MCR, Microsoft.com, .NET, Aspire dashboard. Okay, that's available out there for you to use. You are welcome to run that container. You can use Docker, you can use Podman to launch that and run that wherever you'd like. You can run it on your developer workstation. You can run it on your home server. You can run it on a Raspberry Pi. You can run it on a Raspberry Pi. I think you can run it on a Raspberry Pi. You can run it on the big server you have back in the data center in the corner of the office. All right. All of this is open source. Everybody can connect in and use the dashboard and work with the resources it makes available to you. Now, you can also get the dashboard by lighting up the Aspire app host. Okay. The app host is another template project that we make available to you that allows you to start up your application and connect all of those projects and provide, using C# code, a declaration of the topology of your application system. Now, that's important. That's that's something that gets really interesting and starts to make things a heck of a lot more interesting for us as developers. Let me explain, because that's the orchestration capabilities we have in .NET Aspire. Okay, so you saw I had to go, and in Visual Studio, I've got this, right, multiple project startup dialogue here that I can use to go and say, well, we'll start my API and start my website and run them with debugging and without debugging and configure all of that stuff. And if I'm running in Visual Studio Code, I have a launch profile that looks like this that says, well, go run all of these projects appropriately. And that's nice. That works. It's very hands-on, do it yourself. I'm specifying all the things that I want to run here, but things can get a little dicey if maybe you have a database that you want to connect to and run. Like, I like to run a developer's instance of a Postgres database, and I put that inside of a container so that I can run it locally. And when I'm not actively developing, I want to pause and go play Diablo or World of Warcraft. I want to shut down my databases and other developer tools in the background so I can go play some of my favorite games. Well, having them running in a container makes it real easy for me to just say Docker desktop, shut things down, and I released all those resources and I can go play games. But I need to make sure when I come back and start my application that my database is running again. And a lot of folks have those database tools and services installed locally, but having it run in a container, that's chef's kiss. I can control when it starts and stops appropriately. So what we can do with Aspire is we can move some of that orchestration into C# code as part of the app host project. So we can orchestrate using C# code. You can immediately see the improvements of this compared to things like YAML that you might use for Docker Composed or a kubectl configuration file, right? I don't know about you, but when I'm coding with YAML, I prefer writing tabs inside my code files, and YAML doesn't use tabs, it uses spaces. Well, I immediately get runtime errors because I have the wrong white space in my file. Doesn't matter what syntax I'm using yet, you don't have the right white space. Once we get into syntax, then things start to become interesting because do I have the right syntax that I've used? Is it the right terms? Is it the right commands? Did I use the right quotes? Have I used the bullet in the right place? We're going to use C# to do this. That means I can declare my services with code with a compiler that's going to enforce and check and give me hints that I'm writing code the correct way, that I'm adding on features to my application system the correct way. If you're using and writing code with Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code, you're even going to get GitHub Copilot suggesting configuration for you. Fantastic. Fantastic, right? These are great ways that I can orchestrate and design how my application works. And here you see I'm just saying add project and I define what my project is and I give that project a service name, API service and web front end. They then appear inside the dashboard like this. I have resources that appear, and you can see these are two projects on line 1 and line 2, my API service and my web front end. And remember what I said about health checks? It's showing me that they're running in a healthy state right next to it. And I can also see the endpoints down there in the third to last column, right here, right above my finger, right there. So now I've get insight. Now I can see exactly how my application is running and have those two services right next to each other inside my dashboard. So let's go set those up. Let's orchestrate and get this running on the dashboard. I'll go back over to Visual Studio and it's time for Fritz to live code again. All right. So we'll stop the project and I'll go back over to Solution Explorer. So right now I have my API, I have my Weather Hub, and I have my service defaults. So let's add the next piece of our Aspire solution. And I'm going to add, I'll look for some Aspire templates, and I will add the app host. And I'll just call this app host to make it clear and a little bit easier to go through and find. It is .NET 8. And now I have my app host. So let's open Solution Explorer. I'll pin that there. And it is right here. And there's a program CS. And right now, it's just going to run a distributed application. Set up a distributed application, build it, and run it. This is that entry point where we orchestrate and define how our application system runs. And our application system right now doesn't know about our API on our website. So let's add them into our app host so that it does know about that. And we do it the same way we do other .NET projects. We add references. So once again, I'll grab the Weather Hub project and I'll drag it onto app host. And you'll see it's going to add that project reference. I'll do the same thing with the API, drag and drop it on there. And there's commands you can run at the command line that will do the same thing. But I'm in Visual Studio, so I'm going to do the drag and drop to make that a little bit easier to work with. Okay, so I have those sitting over here, and I want to define those two services for us to use on the dashboard. So let's add them. And it's builder services. I did the wrong one. Builder add project, and I'll use the generic syntax here, and I'll be able to specify projects. Notice there's a projects collection there, and check that out. I added a reference, and it generated this capability for me to step through and find these other projects. So let's add the API. And I'm going to call this, I could call it, look, Copilot's trying to help me out here and say, why don't you just call it API? No, I'm going to call this weather, let's call this NWS for the National Weather Service API. And sure, Copilot, I'll accept your code completion there. And let's also add a project for the web service, the web application. right? There's my weather hub, and I'll call this, I'll just call this dub dub dub, right? Because it's the website, right? I can call this whatever I want. This is an internal name that we can use to reference our application, our components are of this application system elsewhere in the application system. So that's not bad. I can work with that. Let me start this. And actually, I don't have multiple projects that I need to start. I can actually just go in and say, start the app host, and it will start up the dashboard application. It knows it needs to orchestrate these other projects. So it will start those. And as you see here, I get my console starting. I have one console that starts now that manages and handles all of them. Let's take a look. So there you go. You see it started app host. Okay. My application started. And there we go. Here comes the dashboard. So welcome to the .NET Aspire dashboard. We have a bunch of different views here that we can use to take a look at the different parts of our project. So there's the names that we assigned, NWS API, dub. They're available now, and it makes it easier for us to find and associate with which project is which and what they're doing out there, what they're providing for us. Okay. I can also click through and look at that specific endpoint for the application and still interact with it, right? And I can do those searches and use my application just the same way. And because I have those service defaults loaded, I'm getting the resiliency coming through. So I can look at the logs the way that I was before using the dashboard. My logs for the website have moved from a console window into the website, and I can see all of my logs for my website here. And I can flip over to the API, and I can see all of those logs here. All right. Now, there's a lot more that we can do with this that are going to make it even more interesting for us to be able to interact with those. And I can look at those, the traces here, and I can even see where there was an error and where it happened, and be able to interact and view and see what the information was. There's the error. It was an exception, and I can jump right into the logs for that and see that information. The logs have filters and the ability to go through and not just search for a term, but search for different log level information and jump right to exactly what happened and get that information. And as a developer, be able to work with that and respond and do the mitigation steps that we want to work with. All right. So we saw console, we saw traces, and we're now also getting metrics flowing through here, so I can see the number of requests that are coming through. Right, some of these metrics that are automatically published for us for ASP.NET, they're baked in, they're already here, and I can see the requests that are coming through to the API, loaded up and presented here automatically. Go to the duration. There you go. Being updated and presented on screen for us. Okay. Lots of cool stuff that makes it easier for you to interact with and see now how these pieces interact with each other. But that's just one part of it. We're not done yet. Let me head back over to the slides, and I want to pause for a little bit of Q&A, and I see some questions that have come in the chat room. I see some of my colleagues are helping out with some of those questions. Let me get to some of these real quick. I'll click through and put these up on the screen if you don't mind. Thank you so much for changing the layout. The first question here, can I add my View app? It runs via a Node dev server, and in production, it runs on IIS. Yes. So deploying is another topic we're going to get to, but running your Node app is absolutely something you can do. We have components that you're going to add in. We're going to talk about the components in the next the next segment here. I'll stop the project. And right, this is Fritz going off script here. Where'd my Solution Explorer go? So I'll right click into App Host and I will add an Aspire package. We're going to be doing this in just a little bit, but I'm going to add NPM. Come on. I knew it wasn't that one. I thought it was Node. There it is. And it has the ability to host a node-based application. And you can light that up inside your project. So I can say not just add project, but I can say add node app, add NPM app, and reference exactly where that application is living. And it will start up and manage that for you. So that is available. We have tooling available for it. It's growing and improving. But yes, the answer is yes, you can do that. You can work with that. Robbie with a question, can you demonstrate with Docker since there's already a dashboard container image available? I'm not going to run through the demo right now. I want to make sure that I get through the rest of the content we have for the workshop. But you can add, I think you're asking, can you add showing other images, other applications here? I can add a container and specify go start another container out there. And you can, of course, run the Docker, you can run the Aspire dashboard from a container. You saw the commands on the previous slide. I'm not going to go through them right now. I want to make sure I get through the rest of the content. This does partially replace Docker Compose. You can generate Docker Compose statements with an external tool called Aspirate. Folks seem to enjoy using the tool for that. That's great. You don't necessarily have to use that as part of this. Do I have to register class libraries to the app host? No. Your class libraries that you reference and use as part of your applications, in this case, my weather service, down here, you do not have to register those dependencies, those packages. And you can see I added things here for interacting with QuickGrid. You don't have to register QuickGrid, that library, with AppHost. It's with your project. That's all you have to register. You don't have to connect anything else. I'll go to this question from Lemsey. Are containers created in the background? There are container capabilities that are used, and there are, particularly in the components section that we're going to see coming up in just a few minutes, there are containers that are used and managed. The projects that you're adding here, they aren't necessarily being loaded into containers, but there is networking that is put in front of them so that they can communicate easily with the other elements of your Aspire system. Thank you for the question, Lemsey. Freben on YouTube asks, is it possible to secure this dashboard with an authentication mechanism, especially on a production server? Yes and yes. There is authentication that is available, and if I start this again, you'll see it starts up and gives a login key in the console here. I'll let that start. If you run this on Mac or Linux using .NET Run, even on Windows, if you execute it with .NET Run, and you take a look, you'll see there is a login provided here along with a key that you can see to connect. Now, when you do connect out and run the dashboard in some other location, there are claims that it will enforce. There is information about configuring it available on the GitHub website. And we also have some Learn documentation to go with it. So when you start the dashboard, click that GitHub button. It'll get you into the .NET Aspire repo. There are links to documentation and information about how to secure it if you want more granular capabilities with some claims that you can assign. So folks automatically get logged in and they're allowed to have access to reading and interacting with that data. So thank you for the question, Freben. All right. I'm going to scan through just a few more. Folks talking about new features that were added. I'm not going to cover them as part of this because they're not in a release yet. Let me go to this question. Aspire is great during development, but is it usable in production? I don't exactly understand how we can use it in the production environment. Spoiler alert, we're going to show you that in just a few minutes. Um, the short answer is you don't use Aspire in production. Aspire is a developer tool set. It stops at the point that your topology and the connectivity of the observability, service discovery, resiliency, it stops at that code. After that, other tools pick up and do the deployment to production, and the things that happen here in the dashboard fall away by the wayside. These are developer tools. These are things that you don't necessarily want to use in production. You can light up and use the dashboard on Azure Container Apps. It is available for you out there to take a look at and use. However, the dashboard is not an enterprise grade industrial strength tool for managing and looking at telemetry. Tools like Azure Monitor are available that do a great job with that. Loading your configuration into things like Prometheus and analyzing it with Grafana, or using tools from any one of our partners out there like Datadog, uh, SolarWinds, Raygun, New Relic have tools out there and repositories that are that enterprise grade and industrial strength that'll allow you to mine through and query gigabytes and even terabytes of data to get the analysis that you need about your application system. Fantastic. Thank you, James, for helping out with some of the questions there. All right, let me move on and connect over to the next thing we want to talk about, the tooling for .NET Aspire. Look, you saw me connect in and use a couple things here. I even did that add Aspire package here. But there's things you saw, we can automatically add the service defaults inside our project. But when you add other projects, you can even turn on and say, add this project into my Aspire orchestration, and it will automatically set up the service defaults for your project. It'll automatically add that reference to the app host and make it easier for you to do the right thing with configuring and enabling other application components, configuring other application services with your overall Aspire system. All right. So, continuing here, we're going to talk about service discovery. We put that API out there, and we have the application, the website out there, and if they're running in a container, they might not necessarily be running inside the same and being able to see each other on the same network segment, and they might have different names and things when they get deployed and move around. So how do we manage that? How do we handle that? Well, right now I've got everything loaded into an app settings config, and we've got some endpoints logged in there as configuration items. Maybe I've got environment variables that I'm setting on that app service, on that VM, wherever it is that that application is running, that says, hey, here's where to go to find that other thing. And right, it can get dicey, right? Gosh, if I don't have that configuration variable, throw a configuration error because I don't know where to go get the production endpoint for our weather content. So managing those connection strings, and as our topology grows, and having to understand which services need to get connected to which, and which entries need to be loaded into those applications, can get quite ominous of a process to manage. And we've recognized this, and we see this as something that we want to make easier for you to do. So service discovery is part of the features that you can add into your app host project. So we did the API service. We defined it initially with this syntax, add project API service. Well, we can assign that API service to a variable. We know how to do that in C#. That's C# 1.0 stuff. We know how to do that. But what we can do now is, when we said define that web front end service, add a reference with reference to the API service. And what this does is it now makes my API visible to the web project using the exact same service name that I declared up here, API service, inside quotes, API service down here. Now I don't need to go and configure that in all the places. That configuration is going to be made available for me and for all of my various parts of my application system so that it passes around and they know how to communicate with each other. And here's the best part: you already know how to do this. We're just going to streamline and script and put a nice interface over how we do this using the standard capabilities that are already baked in there. We know in ASP.NET projects, we can set environment variables. So for our web front end, we're going to set an environment variable here that says for the API service you might be requesting, here's the actual location that you're going to go to and resolve. So these are the same things that you could already be doing with ASP.NET Core. But it's kind of tricky and it's not exactly discoverable in the documentation. We're going to make it real easy for you to do this and do it the right way to start so that you don't have to think about this. It's just easier to do the right thing. Let's head back over to the demo and let's start connecting those services and make it a heck of a lot easier to work with our API. Now, I called this NWS API up there with a dash in the middle. I'm going to get rid of that dash just to make it a little bit more readable and make it a little bit more host name like. And I'm going to go over here and call this just the API. All right. So I have an API, and you see I'm getting the hint here from Visual Studio that API is actually a resource builder of type project resource. And it's called NWS API. So if I do that same with reference here, and I'll add in API. Notice, just like we showed in the slides, with reference is pointing to the variable that defines my API project. So I've connected inside the Aspire system that's going to start up and manage our projects. I've connected these two services, these two projects. I'll go back over to my Weather Hub and I can go into my app settings, and where we had hard coded here, here's your weather endpoint. I don't need to do that anymore. I can go back over here to program, and where we said, well, here's the weather endpoint, go get it out of builder configuration. I don't need to do that anymore. I can change that, and I can change the URI here to HTTPS plus HTTP, and that looks kind of weird. I'll talk about that in a minute. NWS API. Now that looks weird. Let's talk about that for a second. HTTPS plus HTTP says, and this is a feature of ASP.NET, try to make the secure connection first, the HTTPS connection. If you can't, fail over and use the HTTP connection for the NWS API. And that string is the same as what was defined over here. So my application, my web application, is using the same name for this API service that we assigned to it. Let's start the application and see how it works. I see a couple of really good questions coming in there. I want to make sure that I answer them and get through. I've got a couple more demos here. We should be able to get through all of this. We got about 30 minutes left on our time together. Piece of cake. We got this. All right, here we go. There's my console for the app host starting up. Here's the dashboard, and we can see NWS API is up there. Dub. My endpoints, if I wanted to go look at that Swagger endpoint, it's right here. I have the other endpoint for the web service. It's right here. And we can see it's still connecting and getting the same data. Taking a look back in my app host resources, I can click into the details over here, and it's going to show me all the things that were configured for the website. And if I scroll down in here, here's the endpoints that the web server is answering on. And if I continue scrolling down, I can see all the things that it's set up for publishing, some of that logging information, some of that telemetry information. And there's my services right down here. I can click the little eyeball and I can see here's the addresses that it's communicating to the other, right into the web application for where the API lives. The API lives at localhost 7032. There it is down there. So it's made that connection for me. This is information that I don't have to manage anymore. I don't care what the host name is. I don't care what the port is. Aspire is connecting them for me. All right. Let me, where do I want to go? I think there was one other thing. No, that's all I wanted to show here. All right. Let me head back over to the slides. I've got a couple questions that I want to make sure that I answer. And then we'll jump into the next demo. First question here: can we configure 2 or more instances of a service, like in a Kubernetes YAML file? Yes, there is an option that you can set up over here. Let me jump back over to the code. So if I go and look at the API up here, I can say with replicas, and I can specify how many I want. 3, and it will start up 3 instances of it for me. All right. So you absolutely can do that. Next question. As you mentioned, it's not for a production environment, but I want to use it because it's, well, hang on. Aspire, the developer tooling things that you see here, get you configured so that you can build and deploy a properly orchestrated and connected with great telemetry and logging application. Those things are independent of the Aspire tooling that's in the dashboard. When we deploy, it's still using the same features and tools and capabilities when you get to Azure or AWS or Kubernetes. All of those things that you would use in those locations, it's still using. You absolutely can build and deploy and use the tools that you've built with Aspire, the resources that you've defined with Aspire. There are tools that will help you define and deploy and connect those capabilities. We'll talk more about that when we get to the deployment demo coming up in a few minutes here. Last question we have here: can you pass around secrets other than connection strings? Absolutely. You can pass around client IDs, client secrets, whatever it is that you want to share between your various services. When we deploy to Azure, it particularly sets up an Azure Key Vault and will store those secrets in Key Vault for you by default, and will pass around those as secret references to the Key Vault so that as administrators, as developers, we're not privy to those secrets as they're being managed in our application. All right, taking a look. All right, continuing on, let me go back over to the slides and let's jump into the next topic: components. So components, we've built with 2 projects here. I showed you a little bit of a component there where we brought in the ability to add NPM hosted projects, node projects. But what if I want to add in other things, right? I mentioned databases and other things that are in containers, and I showed you how you can add a container. But there's components that are available out there that are optimized for collaborating and working with Aspire. Things like RabbitMQ, Redis Cache, SQL Server, Postgres, Cosmos DB that'll help you connect in and run those services locally as a developer in a test scenario so that you can interact with them and not run into any issues standing up and knocking down test services in some sort of a test environment or production environment. We'll bring in those pre-configured services running in a container so that it doesn't matter if you break it, if you misconfigure it, we can knock that down and start up a new instance. No penalty, no cost to you. It's just a container running on your local instance. And we've connected it with all of the orchestration capabilities and telemetry capabilities so that you can also see the telemetry coming and going out of those components. Fantastic. Makes it a heck of a lot easier for you then to be able to see exactly what's going on as your queries run on SQL Server, as the cache keys are read and set in Redis. You can see all of that on your dashboard and interact with it as a developer. And when we choose to go deploy to a production space, it'll deploy these containers appropriately to that location if you'd like, or you can configure it to use an appropriately hosted service running on Azure, running on AWS, or use the container on Kubernetes if you'd like. So how do we do this? How do we bring these things in and start working with other components? You saw me do it a little bit there earlier. You can bring in a package that in a specially constructed Aspire package, and they're all called Aspire something, right? And then you're able to, just like we added a project, you can add Postgres, you can add Redis, give it a service name, and then reference it using that same with reference capability in your other system components. Becomes real easy then to start to see how your one project that is just that web project started up with a Postgres database right next to it. When you're debugging and working locally with all the Aspire tools running and you're connecting into the Postgres database, works great. Set up that Redis output cache. See how your application works with the output cache and interact with it. And when you're done and you stop all your services, no problem. Everything shuts down and you're left in the same state you were before you started debugging. And Redis and Postgres are just the tip of the iceberg. There's other containers out there for MySQL, SQL Server. There's RabbitMQ containers out there. There's more containers coming online all the time. The Aspire team is working with and coordinating with a bunch of different folks in the community to activate and make more capabilities available to you in this very opinionated, orchestrated, and choreographed way that makes it easy for you to set up and use those tools quickly and easily. All right. So, yeah, I, in all my practices, I've gone through and I've talked about these things and I completely forget. Hey, the next slide actually has the arrows pointing to the things you're pointing to with your finger. These tools that you reference, Postgres, Redis, MySQL, SQL Server, it'll automatically download and install those for you using Docker Desktop or Podman, your choice. Okay, there's configuration options available for both. It prefers Docker, but there is a configuration setting you can configure to light up Podman. There's documentation on Learn that'll get you set up with that. So we then integrate with our components by using the same libraries and things that we have in our ASP.NET applications, in our worker process applications, to introduce those capabilities, right? So I use output cache. Yeah, I'm already doing that inside my project, but I wanted to use Redis for it. So while I have the add service defaults, we're going to add Redis output cache, give it the same name as a cache service, and that output cache will then start writing to Redis instead of using local memory. So, yep, sets up logging and telemetry. Let's get back into the demo and talk about and see exactly how this works. So here I am back in our source code. I'll go to the app host and I'm going to add an Aspire package. Let's add the Redis output caching because here's the deal. Think about this for a second with me, friends. There's Aspire hosting Redis. The weather forecast doesn't change every minute. It probably changes once every 15 minutes, every half hour. So I could reliably output cache from my API for at least 15 minutes the current weather forecast that was delivered for Manhattan, Philadelphia, what have you. So I've added the Redis output cache component. So here inside of app host, I'm inside program CS. I can now add that Redis cache. So I'll call this cache. And no, that's not quite right. I'm going to say add Redis. And let's just call this output cache. All right. There it is. I have Redis available to me. and I want to output cache it right here with my API. So I'll do with reference, cache. There we go. So now my API knows about a Redis cache service. It's going to be given the connection string information to connect into that Redis service. I'll pivot now and go back over to the API, and I'm going to add a package here. All right. So I'm going to add a .NET Aspire package. And this time we're going to add Aspire Stack Exchange Redis output caching. This is a special version of the output caching NuGet package that knows how to use the Aspire orchestration capabilities and connect over to Redis. So inside my API, down to program over here. So I will just say builder, add Redis output cache. All right. And we called it output cache, right? Once again, that name is the same name of the service that we assigned over here. That string needs to match exactly, capitalization and all. So you can see there it is. And now my API knows about a Redis output cache. All right. And if we take a look at the endpoints down here, right, my endpoints have some output caching already built in to cache for 15 minutes when we go and get a forecast. So let's start this again now that we've added that Redis cache component, and we'll see how this starts up and how Redis now enters the dashboard and becomes part of our application system. So here's my console starting. All right. There we go. So now you see my named service output cache is right up top. It's not a project, it's a container that's running, and it tells me the name of the container that was used to load up and start that. You can provide an override if you'd like a different version. There's configuration options available for that. I can look at the logs for that container and see exactly how it started up and got running. So let's connect over and start getting some data and see how this works. So I'm going to go through and let's choose, I'm going to choose, you know what, let's go over to change the state. I'm going to go to Pennsylvania. So we'll look at Pennsylvania here, and I can go through and click into some of these. And the data for these now, you see, is coming back much, much faster because it's being output cache. I'll go back over here and let's look at the trace. And now things get a little bit more interesting, right? Now I can click in here and see that it went to go get the list of zones, my observation locations, and it went to get it out of Redis and return that content. I'll back up. The next one here, right? This took a half a second. That might as well be an eternity. So there we presented the website. We went to get the forecast from the API for a specific endpoint, right? And I can view that and I can see exactly what it requested. PAZ005. And it checked in the output cache. Hey, do you have cache for me? Do you have that? No. So it went to API Weather Gov. And I can click in and see exactly that request that it made. It got that data, and then we can see here it set that data in the Redis output cache. Further, if we scroll down a little bit here, we go to one of these here, there it is. The API is trying to get a specific forecast, and it found it in Redis cache and returned it. All right. Now it's becoming more interesting. Now I've got a full view of my website's being interacted with. It's interacting with my API. It's getting it from the third-party service, presenting and interacting with it in the cache. All right. Really, really interesting and compelling stuff that we're starting to see, making this much easier to work with. The resiliency, the output caching, and being able to view all of that information. So much more that we now have full control over, and we can see how it works inside of our application system. All right. Let me pause for a minute. Let me go back to Q&A over in chat and catch up with things. There's the Q&A slide. So let me catch up with some of the questions here. Lemsey with our first question. Will the logs of the components also go into the dashboard? So I showed the logs go over there, and I also showed some of the telemetry entering. So if we view the details over here, right, there's the details that came out of the telemetry that were put on the dashboard. Let me hide that. You can see some of that information. And if there were structured logs that were written, we'd be able to see it here, but there isn't for this one. But you would, if it is orchestrated by that component, you would be able to see all of those logs. Continuing here, Arnon asks, what if we don't use containers? Is Aspire still relevant? So it is, because you can still orchestrate and connect into executables. We've got a great example of somebody who used, and we've actually got some very big customers that are using Aspire to orchestrate and connect into Unreal Engine servers to be able to interact with data there and orchestrate and get telemetry information coming out of it and passing the service discovery in. So you absolutely can do that with executables. Like I mentioned, these folks were using Unreal Engine. I've seen folks do this also with other types of applications that are built with the rest of the .NET stack. So you have many, many options. The containers are going to allow you to start up these other services very easily and use them as a component inside of your larger application. So, all right. Thanks for that question. Let me go back over to the slide. Continuing here, Sacred Geometry. Hello. Let's say you have a shared development environment that has a bunch of services and you want to run only one of them locally. Okay. Then you don't have to run all of them, right? You can coordinate and turn on or off in that app host just the features that you want to run locally. And if you have a shared database server, great. You can set up and pass just the connection string for that database server. You can force just that connection string to be sent into your application. So when we go back over to our program here, this with reference here is just sending in a connection string. I can create and define that connection string here. The dev database connection string. I can say that that's builder add connection string, and I can specify what that connection string is and pass that into my application instead of some other service here, right? I can pass in that database connection string instead of start up a container and run that service. Okay. So good question. Thank you for that. Let's see. Is there any way to, say, shut down a service in the midst of use? No, there isn't a way to shut down and restart services yet. That's a common requested feature that we've heard. As of the 8.0 version of .NET Aspire and .NET, that is not part of our current set of features, but it is requested and on the agenda to be discussed in the future. Is there any way to swap out the resources configuration at runtime? Sure. This is just C# code. You want to swap it out and do something else at another time? Absolutely. You have control there. So you can certainly, right, inspect, right. I can reach into environment, get environment variable at right. I can ask for, what region are you running in? And, I could say if that region is Europe, then, right, because we've got a variable that's set when we log into our workstations, then go set up the European resources appropriately because we have different constraints and requirements due to various legal jurisdiction Absolutely, you can do that. Um, but and I'm just using environment here as an example. You can use pretty much any type of configuration check that you want here. It's full code. You're not limited to a scripting language here. You want to check the date, and if it's May, do one thing, but if it's June, do another thing. Sure, you can do that too, because it's it's a full C sharp interaction that you have here. It's a real application that you're working with. So swap out and build appropriately there. Loviz on Twitch asks, you can't use Aspire with Azure Service Fabric, can you? We don't have a component that'll connect you with it. However, as you saw me add a connection string, you can add the connection strings and pass them in appropriately. You won't be able to get the orchestration that you saw me do with Redis there. There is orchestration available for Service Fabric. I'm sorry. Not I'm sorry. There is orchestration available for Service Bus. Too many service things that you can use, and it will give you some of that insight to work with as well. So, all right, I need to move on because we've got about 10 minutes left, and I've got about 20 slides left to go through here. Woo! All right, moving on. Here we go. So, deployment. This is the thing that a number of folks were asking about. So there is flexible integration and deployment capabilities available here. There we go. And we want to make sure that it's something that you can start up and get working with easily. You can do it the same way you do today, because all we're doing is enhancing how these various components and applications work together now. You're not using a component in your production space, in your cloud service. You're using Azure Redis Cache. You're using Azure SQL and the Azure Managed SQL instances. You can absolutely use those exact same things, passing in the connection string when you get to the production environment and your hosting service. We have a series of developer tools, the Azure Developer CLI, the AWS CDK, that will take the output of an Aspire configured application and turn it into the appropriate deployment scripts to light up on AWS, on Azure, the services you need to run your application properly. Really good stuff there. And of course, we have good old Visual Studio available for you to right click publish, and it will publish your entire application system to wherever it is that you want to target. So we've got a little video here that we included just to make it easier to see this, and so that we don't have to go through and watch Fritz deploy, because it takes a little bit of time for some of this stuff to get deployed out there. So right click publish, you go through and you say, I want to go to Azure, because of course you like the big blue fluffy cloud out there. And you can choose which environment you want to publish to, give it a resource group name, and you'll see it deploy there. And of course, we've sped this up a little bit so that you can see everything in just a few seconds here. It does take a few minutes to deploy because it's provisioning a number of features for you. But I want to make sure that you see here, it deployed using the configuration we have in that sample code, a container app for the API service, a container app for my weather hub, and by default, it put the Redis cache into a container app as well. Those container apps run on top of a container app environment. It provisioned one of those, and it set up a container registry that's private to you and your application system that you're building with Aspire, so that it has those containers for the current versions of the code you wrote for your weather and for the API in this case. Additionally, a managed identity so that we can make sure that all the connections are secured, and only the application principal that we want to run this application has access to communicate and interact with all the resources for our Aspire system. We get a log analytics workspace that's going to save off all the logs that we have out there so you can analyze and work with it. And on Azure, all of this falls under a unified resource group. In this case, we named it Awesome Weather. Aspire and the Azure Developer Tools put a little RG dash prefix in front of it so that you can find that resource group easily on Azure. All right. So, yeah, that's the video again. Thank you. So, cloud ready stack of built for building observable, production ready distributed applications. So many things that are built, available, integrated directly into your application system and tools that don't change the way you do things, but make it easier for you to do the right things that you should be doing from the get go, that are going to make your management of your applications and your productivity in growing those applications so much better. There's a lot more that's coming for Aspire. There's deep integration into the tooling templates that are available out there, so much more that are going to make you and your application construction better. All right. It's easy to get started. There's an SDK workload for you to install. We've got instructions available both in the workshop documentation and available inside the templates that come with Visual Studio that you can find out there. Easy to build. You saw me add service discovery, how we lit up and used the developer dashboard. It's my new favorite application to hang out and navigate around and see how my application is running. The logs, the metrics, the distributed traces make it very clear how our application is running. And it becomes real easy to deploy. Use the same scripts, the same commands that you have now to and publish your app with the topology that you want, or use tools like the Azure Developer SDK. I'm sorry, the Azure Developer CLI, the AWS CLI, and be able to deploy to your favorite hosting provider. And there's even tools out there called Aspirate that'll allow you to deploy to Kubernetes as well. All right. There's one more demo here for me to run. I'm just about out of time. So with respect, I'm going to skip the demo. It's going through the starter project. Um, the starter project you can take a look at and step through. All the things are automatically configured for you. It's the same default templates that we get with ASP.NET that you can use and interact with in your application. So there we go. We mentioned earlier, we had the question, gosh, can I add in my Vue application? Absolutely. You can add in any type of application, not just Node. You want to stand up a Python application? Absolutely. The teams actually recently merged in enhancements to allow Python to be enabled and added to your app project, just like we saw the Node sample a little bit earlier. All right. We want to make it easier for you to add those Ruby applications, Python, Node, Go, Rust. You can run those executables directly. You can put those applications in a container. I showed you how you can add a container into your Aspire system, and they will automatically become part of that, become part of your deployment script as you grow your application system. Aspire is for everyone. This is not a .NET only thing. Tell your friends, tell your families, tell your pets. Use .NET Aspire with your next application system that you're building. Not even a full application system, just your application you're building. Because it does the orchestration. It coordinates all those components inside your system. It's going to make it real easy for you to see everything that's going on as a developer and coordinate how things work. All right? That's important. We want to make sure that you're successful and more productive. So we've put these opinionated capabilities together and make it easier to work with all of those features that you want in your application system. So all of these major features, they're integrated directly into this application that you saw me build, and I'm all set to deploy. There's so much more coming with .NET Aspire. I've mentioned deep integration into those tooling templates and more innovations as the team releases updates in the weeks and months ahead. Now, we've covered just the beginning, just the start of how to get into and use Aspire. Okay? If you want to know more, if you want to see about other components, I have another virtual event coming up for you July 23rd. Okay? July 23rd is .NET Aspire Developers Day. And we're going to get into doing so much more. We're going to talk about how to use different databases. You want to use MongoDB? We got you. You want to use SQL Server? Oh, yeah, we're going to talk about that. What about customizing and putting your own components and capabilities into Aspire so that you can do some other things that are specific to your applications because you have needs that are different. Maybe you've got hardware that you need to connect to and work with. Maybe you've got other application systems that you need to be able to connect in and collaborate with. We're going to talk about all those things and so much more. All right. Think of this as the intermediate step and a little bit of advanced topics. It's all free for you to connect into. Check it out, aka.ms/.net Aspire Dev Day. I want to make sure you get all the content, all the links to all the things that we've been talking about today. Check it out. The learning resources, they're right there. The documentation, aka.ms.net Aspire. We have a bunch of videos for you all about what .NET Aspire is. They're available on YouTube. They're recorded online. You can watch them anytime you want. The team responds to comments, aka.ms aspire/videos. And of course, .NET Aspire is open source. Anybody can take a look at it. You can open issues. You can send pull requests, and the team will review them, maybe even accept them. Check it out on GitHub/.net/Aspire. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining me for today's workshop. I hope you had a great time and you learned a lot. I see there's a number of questions there in chat. I'm going to pause now to take some of those questions. We may run a little bit over on time just to go through those last few questions, but I really appreciate you joining us. All right. If you take off now, please. My name is Jeff Fritz. You can find me on X. You can find me on YouTube. You can find me on Twitch. You can find me on GitHub. I am C# Fritz. Let me take a look at some of those questions here. Let me see. Christopher says, can I deploy to different environments? Can we set up to deploy to development or test or staging or production? Absolutely. In addition to using some of the scripts that you may have now that already know how to deploy to different machines, different providers, different hosting services, you can absolutely continue to use those. And built into the AZD tool, we have the notion of environments. So you can add other environments in there and provide different configurations because you're pushing to an integrated development environment that all the developers use, a test environment your quality assurance team uses, a staging environment, maybe even a demo environment for your sales team to use. And you can have all of those environments defined and used using the Azure Developer CLI tool. Great question, Christopher. Thank you so much for asking. And there's documentation on that with the Azure Developer CLI on Microsoft Learn. We have Boparuski there with our next question. My main need with .NET Aspire that is yet to be answered is automatic deployment via CI/CD pipeline, like Azure DevOps, to separate privileges so developers aren't always super admins. Yeah, we want to keep their dirty fingers out of our clean production space, don't we? So here's the deal. When you run AZD init, right, you use the Azure Developer command line, and we'll talk more about that in the Aspire.NET Developer Day. Our friend Brady Gaster had a great session as part of Microsoft Build, where they showed how to do deployment, and they show some of these techniques in there. With the Azure Developer command line, if you run AZD init, it will initialize and set up your first environment to connect and deploy with. And it generates a markdown file called next steps. Inside that next steps file are references and instructions for how to use a pair of scripts, one for GitHub Actions, one for Azure DevOps, that will allow you to connect into different source code repositories and configure that continuous integration, continuous deployment process appropriately to wherever it is that you want to publish. In this case, it's the Azure CLI. It's going to help you get into Azure. Thank you for the question. Next one here I have from, is it Rainier? Is there any Aspire extension for GitHub Actions if I want to have a pipeline that I'm using already? And this is a little bit of what I was talking about that next steps. There is a script that's already built that's available out there, a GitHub Action script available for you that you can download and enhance appropriately for your application so that you can deploy. In particular, the aspirify.net website that I maintain, we've enhanced and added some other things into that. Things like run my unit tests, um, log version information so I can display it in the footer. So it's a good starting point for you to enhance and add those features that you want and you need in your completed deployed production location. Christopher with a follow up question here. Do those different environments typically get their own resource groups? My app dev, my app prod? I would put them in different resource groups when you push to a cloud service. Yes. That way you can control and grant access appropriately to folks on the QA team to be able to access the quality assurance environment, right? Or folks that are in sales support to access the sales demo environment, so on and so forth. Right, having that additional level of fine grained control because you've put those other environments into separate resource groups is going to help you to manage and control the growth of those in the future. Certainly, your test environment doesn't need the same scale as your production environment. They're going to be two different things that behave differently. So putting them in different resource groups will make it a little bit clearer for the folks maintaining and interacting with them that these are part of testing, these are part of production. The production ones, white glove. Nobody touches that except for the operations folks. Testing, we can get in there and tinker and look around a little bit. So it's up to you. Personally, I would recommend keeping them in separate resource groups. Thank you for the question, Christopher. Let me go to this question from Thinking Brain on Twitch. Love the avatar. All right. How about Kubernetes deployment? Does the API endpoint still work with production app settings? No. So, right, in thinking back into the demo, using the app settings configuration that was delivered as part of app settings.json, that might not work because when you get into Kubernetes, your ingress might be set up a little bit differently based on how your application is deployed. We have a great tool available for you called Aspirate, ASPIR, the number 8, that will help you to configure and set up that service discovery when you get into Kubernetes and you want to deploy over there so that it does make those service references appropriately between the various components of your application. It's a great question you have there, Thinking Brain, and we've got you covered with some of the tools that are going to help you deploy to those different environments. I'm going to take one more pass through some of the questions that are over here. Let me hide that message from Thinking Brain. Continuing here. You're welcome for the live. Yes, you're waiting for a dedicated session only for the deployment part. And that's something that I'm going to be covering in a future episode on my live stream on these channels you're watching. The future Wednesday might not be next week, probably be the week after. There is Discord community discussions going on. Thank you, John. Yes, you can check out the dotnet Discord and learn more about it over there. Fantastic. All right. I'll pause for just a few more seconds in case anybody has any other questions. I want to make sure that we help you. And that's the advantage of watching the live. If you didn't watch the live session this time, what are you waiting for? There's plenty more. There's plenty more Let's Learn sessions that are coming up for .NET Aspire that we want you to check out that are going to be in different languages at scheduled and run in different time zones all over the world. Make sure you check them out. You're going to see those events scheduled both on learnmicrosoft.com and you'll see them in the playlist here on YouTube if you're watching on YouTube. Thank you so much for tuning in. I don't see any more questions, so I think we'll wrap it up there. Really appreciate everybody tuning in, being a part. I hope we answered your questions. If you have more questions that we didn't answer, John gave you the link to the Discord. You can ask questions just below. And of course, you can ask us questions on X, formerly known as Twitter. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Jeff Fritz. I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day, wherever you might be. I wish you good health and good coding. Take care. Oh, look, we got confetti. Yay!